Barbara, originally you graduated from university as a painter. How would you describe your development from a painter to a sculptor, and who is now well known as a photographer? Was there any initial moment in your life for this change? Was it your first encounter with Moholy Notch, or what was the reason?
You have, how many years I have to tell you about?
50?
Yeah. Well,
maybe just the beginning.
At the beginning. Well, you were not here long enough to hear the whole story, because at my age, I went through many different phases of experimentation and ideas, but I always felt my beginnings was in painting, and it always felt very much part of my thinking. Even when I approached the pieces in the yellow room, that was a painting process that started me in photography. And of course, Moholy was the inspiration for the photograms. And so from that point on, everything I did kind of was an experimentation of different disciplines. My influence of Moholy was also through the Bauhaus and the ideology of the Bauhaus and their concept of mixing media, of being able to be a photographer, a painter, a performer. All of the different aspects of art was something that they embraced and they mixed. And so that was a basic drive for me. I never had training as a photographer, so I never approached it as a photographer would. I never thought about pushing the boundaries of photography, as we say. It was always about incorporating another medium into photography, or photography into another medium. So I think of the larger pieces here as paintings more than as photographs. I usually don't even call myself a photographer. I'm usually just label myself as an artist in general. And these pieces here were actually the beginning of a real body of work that incorporated the sculpture. So as I started...
Maybe you can say a few words about your practice, because this is the beginning of your practice. Right.
These are Polaroids, as you all know, and they're instant photographs, and there's no darkroom work in this, so that was very appealing to me. And I had, in the 80s, the Polaroid Corporation had a very ambitious program to invite artists, photographers mostly, to use their large-scale camera, which produced these big Polaroids. And in exchange, we would give them a print of what we made. So it was a very free exchange, and it was very supportive of the art world. But all of these pieces that I made were actually assembled in the studio at the Polaroid Corporation, where they had a studio for themselves to use. And so I would make drawings and such of knowing kind of the forms I wanted to use and the vague placement, but not to the point where I followed something extremely to the detail. So these are mirrors. This is a combination of mirror, most of the triangular shapes, most of the shapes that have a color are mirrors reflecting what I call a scrim. And a scrim being a piece of stretched color fabric, something like silk or sheer, and a light behind it to make it glow. And so I could isolate then a shape and make it a color, and I could put that shape anywhere in the sculpture according to how I saw it on the back of the camera. So it became kind of a dance, a performance in a way, between me behind the camera and me, the sculptor, making the piece in front of the camera. So it wasn't, and none of these are permanent. These are not, they're kind of the first installations that I ever made, really. And so they became very flexible and pieces I would use over and over again. But the idea was to create something that intervened with photography in space. So it was more of a spatial concept that then I translated to the back of a camera. I used a big camera, not a little camera, but a 4x5. And it's upside down. That's the way painters are supposed to look at their paintings sometimes. And so it became an exchange between space and a flat plane transforming space or presenting space. And so it was that really it got me more interested in photography.
Okay. And more or less, one can say that this is your concept until today.
Yes, until today. It's the same idea, only it manifests in many different forms or in different disciplines. But I'm always looking for this dialogue between multimedia.
Okay. So we have to continue in the next space.
Okay.
Now we are standing in a space with your architectural sites from the late 80s. For this production, you left the studio. Can you tell us a bit about this project and about the buildings we see here? Because here we have not small stages, we have real buildings,
right.
Real architecture.
Real architecture. And so it is the same concept, as we mentioned, and I took it from the studio into the real world. And these are very well-known buildings, mostly in New York. And I installed, how to start, this is really a big production. This was like making a film. It was very cinematic. I had a crew of maybe 10 people working with me all night long to produce 2 pictures, 2 photographs. But the preparation took months because I would go to each site and I would analyze it and decide what point of view I wanted to take the picture. I would actually develop the picture. So in a different way than the studio at Polaroid, where it was more spontaneous, this was very exacting and planned. And what the idea was to have a commentary on postmodern architecture. It was it was 1980s, and I was asked to do illustrations for an article at Vanity Fair magazine. And so they were the sponsors, which I would have to have because all these buildings had security guards and valuable architecture, valuable objects in the architecture. And so I needed that kind of sponsorship, and it was very expensive. So it was like a movie production. And these are, for instance, this is the High Museum in Atlanta. And this is a Richard Meyer architect, is the architect. And if you know his work, you know it's always pure white. And I colored it with color light. So they're big movie cinematic lights, and they're covered with colored gel. And with precise working from a film crew who know how to make a sharp edge so that this is pink and that's red. There were different, techniques that I had to rely on them to do. But then this is a mirror that's inserted into the frame of the picture. And if you could see the whole situation, where we're standing would be all wires and lights and such, and this is just the isolated view of the of this statue, Lydia, I think it is. It's a famous mythological figure, and then the rest is all the color projection. So this is the one photograph I would make that night. And the others, what happened at Vanity Fair was that they never actually produced the issue that I was supposed to be in, because some famous person did something outrageous and they went to the cover instead. But it began for me a series of works that I could then continue, because in New York, for instance, that's the Equitable Building in New York, and it's a Liechtenstein painting. And the concentration of the article was on the interior, the atriums, the big entrances that were part of postmodern thinking and architecture. So that, that has the painting in it as the focus, but then there's two mirrors. And the idea of the mirrors was to abstract the space to the point that you're looking in one direction, but the mirrors are giving you information of the rest of the architecture around you, so that it's a collage, but it's a collage in reality. It's not after the fact. In fact, it's always fun to show a 20-year-old these things, because they immediately think it's done in a computer. Until I point out the date, which is like 1982 or 84. And this is a Frank Lloyd, Frank Gehry, and that's a building, a law school in LA. This is a E.F. Hutton building in New York by Kevin Roche, and that is the World Financial Center before it got covered with 9/11 dust, yeah.
I would like to talk with you about the colors and the space. Color is very important in your work, and I still mentioned that in Wolfsburg, the first venue of the exhibition was more or less a white cube exhibition. Here we both decided to have a colored concept. Before I proposed to have black walls, and then you said to me, why can't we have colored walls? So how did you choose the colors?
Well, I don't know if I even ever mentioned to you, but a lot of my thinking behind that direction was the Imi Knoebel. You know, the relationship to his work.
You didn't mention.
No, I never did. See, sometimes I forget very important things, but anyhow, that was the beginning of my thinking, and I liked the idea when I saw the layout of making this structure that becomes the whole gestalt of the gallery, the work, and ties it all together. So. It came from all of those aspects, and your willingness to do something crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we have more an installation, like an exhibition, and that's the idea I very much like. Okay, one last question in the next space. Yeah, in recent years you have expanded your practice to include the production of videos. What was the reason for this decision?
Well, it goes back to the first works in the first room there. The idea of my movement from in front of the camera to behind the camera became, in some ways, a performance. And I thought what the work was lacking that needed to sort of complete a Bauhaus idea was movement. And so that was the inspiration, really, to add a video, to work in video. But then it became more about video and putting the pieces back into the video as sculpture that I had been photographing. And that kind of led to this more sculptural aspect. The pieces on the wall there were before well, they actually were simultaneous to the photographs because I was working in a photographic medium to create the background, the space, and then the materials that are in there are what I added to the front, so that you had the experience of being in, a sculptural, real, tactile material, and then a mindset of going into space through the photograph. And I found this plexi material that I liked. And materials have always been extremely important in the motivation for the work, the examination of material, its properties, the kind of qualities that it possesses is many times what creates the concept behind the work. So I kind of work with the material and allow it to do its thing, so to speak. And when I found this material with that glowing edge and a material that was used in the 80s, there was lots of resonance for me in that. It was like drawing, and then it's like a photogram. This piece is, the light projects it on the floor and it becomes a photogram of the piece. So all those things rolled into one made me pursue the idea of mixing again the mediums, but also getting into more of the realistic space that exists. And that was actually probably how it got going. There is another book coming out of the last 5 years since 2015 to 2020, before COVID, of this body of work, which only happened because I lived long enough to do it. It was like something in my mind from probably the very beginning. But I'm very fortunate that at this point in time, I still have the energy and I still have the opportunity to be able to develop ideas. So I'm really lucky to have you invite me to do this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to have you here. It was a pleasure to work with you. Thank you.